Greetings, brothers and sisters in Christ. Father Timothy Naples here at St. John Vianney Parish, South Burlington, Vermont. I'm going to read for you a presentation that I've made on the chains of St. Peter and the Diocese of Burlington, Vermont. This gives the chronology of the chains of St. Peter and the link of those chains that he brought to Burlington, Vermont, from Bishop DeGoesbriand's publication, Our First Bishop in Vermont. The publication will be referenced later as to exactly what book is giving this chronology. Of the most ancient records, in the early 2nd century, St. Balmeda found the chains of St. Peter's Mamertine imprisonment hidden by Peter's contemporaries, and that they were given to Theodora, who built a church on the Equiline Hill for veneration. This account of the 100s AD is given from the Acts of the Martyrdom of St. Alexander. In 437 AD, Eudoxia, the wife of Emperor Valentinian III in Rome, received one of the 2 Jerusalem chains of Peter's Jerusalem imprisonment from her mother Eudoxia, who obtained them on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So there were 2 chains from the Jerusalem imprisonment. In 437 or 38 AD, Pope St. Leo the Great joined the 2 chains in Rome, that is, one of the chains from the Jerusalem imprisonment and the chain of the Mamertine imprisonment. The legend states that the 2 chains were joined miraculously. In 438, Eudoxia, responsible for bringing the Jerusalem chains, one half of them, to Rome, she patronized the building of a new church, the Church of St. Peter in Chains in Rome. That was the foundation for the current church, mostly now redone. In the 500s to 700s AD, some links were granted by the popes as relics individually, and filings from the links of these chains were sometimes encased in keys made of gold as papal gifts. In 772 AD, Pope Adrian I sent 7 links to Didier, or Desiderius, the king of Lombardy and the father-in-law of Charlemagne. In 969 AD, devotion grows when Pope John XIII uses the chains to exorcise evil spirits from the count of the Emperor Otho. Details of this story are hard to come by, but it is certainly what is pictured in the ceiling of the current Church of St. Peter's Chains in Rome. This is a snapshot of that picture on the ceiling of the church. In 1592 AD, the 7 links sent to Desiderius were returned to Rome under Pope Clement VIII by the work of Cardinal Strafandi, the cardinal protector of the Church of St. Cecilia, who brought the links to this same church. Now, in 1877 AD, an author named Paul Mencacci wrote a book about the chains of St. Peter, containing the account of the 7 separated links, how they were sent to Desiderius, the father-in-law of Charlemagne, just before the year 800, and how Cardinal Sfondrati brought those 7 links back to Rome to the Church of St. Cecilia's. This is important to know that Paul Mencacci recorded this history in his 1877 book. We come to Bishop DeGoesbriand, the first bishop of Burlington. In 1893, he had a trip to Rome. February 1893, Bishop DeGoesbriand left the United States through New York with a priest associate, Father Audette. February 17th, Bishop DeGoesbriand arrived in Rome for the February 19th Jubilee of Pope Leo XIII. February or March, Bishop DeGoesbriand visits the Church of St. Peter in Chains, and he is so impressed that he asks immediately for a facsimile of the chains to be made to bring to Vermont. So a facsimile of the chain links of St. Peter, the relics of St. Peter's chains, which were still intact and on display in 1893 in the Church of St. Peter in Chains. The top left picture shown here is me visiting those chains. Very hard to see them in the background, but right there you see a big glass case with a few chains just visible on the inside there. And the facsimile that Bishop DeGoesbriand obtained is pictured next right here. Below that is the facsimile kept in Burlington, Vermont. Here we have some youth visiting our cathedral and Bishop Coyne just explaining what these chains are doing in this display case in our cathedral. Those are the facsimile chains that Bishop DeGoesbriand had made. In early April of 1893, Bishop DeGoesbriand happens upon Paul Mancacci's book, and he speaks to the Cardinal Rampolla, who's the Vatican Secretary of State and the Cardinal Protector of St. Cecilia's Church. Bishop DeGoesbriand shares the Book of Mancacci and asks for a link to bring to America. Cardinal Rampolla at St. Cecilia's Church defers to the necessity of the Pope's permission. In fact, with this whole exchange, Cardinal Rampolla did not know that these links from the 800s had been separated and then had come back to St. Cecilia's Church. He didn't even know this until Bishop DeGoesbriand showed him the book, and then they went to check. This picture is a little blurry, but this is the chapel of St. Cecilia's where relics are kept, and it included the 7 links of the chains of St. Peter. April 20th, Bishop DeGoesbriand met with Pope Leo to ask for a link from the 7 links that were kept at St. Cecilia's. The Pope says a decision will be made later. So on April 21st, Bishop DeGoesbriand, having obtained his facsimile, the imitation links modeled after the ones that were on display, took those and he touched them to, quote, the tomb of St. Peter. We don't know where in St. Peter's he went to touch them, but he says he touched them to the tomb of St. Peter. Bishop DeGoesbriand left Rome April 22nd for a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. While in the Holy Land, Bishop DeGoesbriand took those facsimile chain links that we saw. He took them to the grounds and sites of Mount Carmel, Nazareth, Gethsemane, and the altar of the Scourgery, to Calvary and to the Holy Sepulchre, and he touched them to all of the holy sites. On May 28th, Bishop DeGoesbriand returned to Rome. On June 4th, he again meets with Pope Leo XIII, and he obtains permission to take a link of the chains in St. Cecilia's. These links, again, were not being venerated like the links that he had the facsimile made of, and so he goes on June 8th and he gets a link from the reliquary chapel at St. Cecilia's, and an official letter testifies to the relic signed on June 12th. In mid-June, having returned to Vermont, a booklet is printed in Burlington summarizing the life of St. Peter and briefly relating that the facsimile and the relic, this is the one link from St. Cecilia's, were obtained in Rome. We can read in pages 5 through 23 of the 1897 book, or we can see below. This booklet I'm referring to is where much of this information comes from. On August 1st, the Diocese of Burlington was consecrated to St. Peter after processing the link of St. Peter's chains around the Immaculate Conception Cathedral. On November 21st, additional notes were added to the booklet, resulting in the first publication of a book about the relics of St. Peter. That is a full-scale book. Here's the August 1st act of consecration that was made in 1893. Perhaps I can go back to this slide and read it as a closing prayer. This is obtained, as you see, from the archives of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Burlington. And if you can read the small print, an imprimatur was given by Bishop DeGoesbriand in 1894 for an indulgence when praying this prayer at the cathedral with 10 Our Fathers at St. Peter's altar, or that is wherever the relic of the chain of St. Peter was being kept. In 1894, on August 4th, this is a year after the August 1st consecration to St. Peter, a public translation was done with the relics into a newly made reliquary altar piece. Pages 35 through 53 of the 1897 book gives the sermons and the letters delivered on the occasion of this translation, and they were printed that day in 1894, or the next day, in the Burlington Free Press. In 1897, copies of Bishop DeGoesbriand's final book, the final edition of these accounts, with an added preface to the second edition and appendices, were published. Before commenting the pictures, I just note that the published version has been scanned and is now available online. The pictures in the top left are myself, again, visiting the relics of St. Peter's chains, the ones that are still on display on that same location where we heard from the 300s AD that a church had originally been built. Although according to the historical records, the chain links held here are not the entirety of the chains. As we know, those 7 links were removed and then later brought to St. Cecilia's, and that other links were reportedly given away through the historical records. Here we have the actual link pictured of the one that Bishop DeGoesbriand brought back from St. Cecilia's on display in St. John Vianney Church. And here is the reliquary altarpiece where this was meant to be displayed, or whether it was displayed, we saw from that August 4th translation event that Bishop DeGoesbriand held, and it was on display in the cathedral. And happily, this reliquary was not destroyed in the fire that burned Immaculate Conception Cathedral. So it was preserved, as well as, of course, the relic, which wouldn't have been destroyed by a fire anyway, since it is completely made of iron. With that, I simply want to point out that the ubipetrusvt.com is the location of my blog, where I've shared a number of these stories, but it's also where you can download the entire booklet, which contains all of this history that I have just presented. If I may, go back and read the prayer of the consecration as our concluding prayer. O Jesus Christ, Son of God, equal to the Father, who wert incarnate for us men and for our salvation, who founded thy church upon Peter and promised that the gates of hell should never prevail against it, we return thanks to thee for having made us members of this thy church, and we promise to ever remain obedient children of thy vicar on earth. And thou, blessed Peter, Prince of the Apostles, who didst labor so faithfully and suffer so many trials, imprisonments, and death itself, for the honor of thy Master and the welfare of the Church, accept our resolution to ever love, to venerate thee, and to confide in thy powerful intercession. Look down from on high, O Lord, upon this diocese, which was consecrated to the hands of at the hands of its first bishop, consecrated to St. Peter, but especially upon the city and upon this congregation, which possesses most glorious memorials of the chains which blessed Peter carried in the prisons of Jerusalem and Rome. Avert from us by thy prayers, O Peter, the horrors of war, of famine and of pestilence. Be thou our protector forever. Be mindful of the chains which thou carriedest so long. Be mindful of the death which thou sufferest for us. Obtain that we may all serve God our Creator in the unity of faith and communion, ever ready to suffer and to die for love of Him who died and suffered for us. Amen. I hope you have enjoyed. So peace be with you, and may God bless you.